Hello, my name is Mattie Cummins. I'm a social worker that has been working with people with brain injuries for about 25 years, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about concussions and mild traumatic brain injuries. The reason I say I'm going to talk a little bit about it, this is a very, very complicated topic. Anytime you talk about brain injuries, it can be very complicated. And so what I really want to do is just give you a flavor and some small snippets of what it means to have a traumatic brain injury and a concussion, and what that might do to impact your life. It is a very complicated subject because brains are very complicated, and you'll understand that as we move through today. So we're going to talk about what is a traumatic brain injury. So it's some pretty big words that you are hearing a lot more than we used to, but really it's just an injury to the brain. Traumatic means, it can mean different things to different people, but for the purpose of our discussion, it's actually a blow to the head, or what we call a coup contre coup, where there's a whiplash effect, but essentially that the skull and the brain come in contact together, which can cause some shearing of the neurons, as well as some bruising too. And so that, for our purposes today, that's what we'll be talking about. So I think a big question I always get asked is concussion a TBI? And the answer is yes. Concussion is a traumatic brain injury. It's just a milder form of that medically, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But it's really, again, an event that happens that's induced trauma to the brain. So we hear lots of things about sports concussions. They are traumatic brain injuries. We hear lots of things about motorcycle accidents, and maybe there's a concussion along with other issues. That's a trauma to the brain. So anytime there's a trauma to the brain, it is a traumatic brain injury. It's just the medically, when it medically happens, whether it's mild, moderate, or severe. And concussions are mild. I think what's really challenging about the term mild concussion is that it sounds very mild. And what I mean by that is, I've been working in this world for a long time, and sometimes I think people with mild traumatic brain injuries or concussions, when they have symptoms afterwards, it's really hard for them because there's no hospitalization, there's no I was in a coma. It's sometimes a repeated concussion over and over, and then suddenly there's all these symptoms, but you don't have anything medical to hold on to say, this big thing happened to me. In addition, the mild often makes us think that the symptoms are also mild, and that's not necessarily the case. Often those symptoms can be functionally pretty challenging for people, and we'll talk about those symptoms, but that mild concept makes us think, in our culture, it makes us think that it's no big deal, and it can be a very big deal for some people. What I think is really important too is that sometimes these mild traumatic brain injuries fall through the cracks and they don't get diagnosed. And often we hear people, and I have talked to people that 5 years down the road, they had a concussion, and then they went to the ER, and or didn't go, but they went to the ER and told them they were okay, and then they left, and then over a period of time, everything starts falling apart because they have a brain injury, and so there's all these symptoms coming up that they don't understand because the ER has told them, you're good. And so suddenly all these symptoms start coming up, and we'll talk about those in a moment, that really cause really functional issues like being able to keep your job, being able to maintain a relationship, being able to not get frustrated when people annoy us, because that's the way the world works sometimes. And so I think this mild label can be very deceiving for people. One of the things that I think is really important is we're going to talk a little bit about the brain. I'm not going to get into it a lot because this is a very complex subject. But the thing to remember about the brain is we all take it very for granted. Anybody that has a brain injury can tell you this. The brain is everything we do, we see, we breathe, we eat, we know, how we have relationships with people, what decisions we make, my communication with someone, and the brain does all of those things, and it's really something that we take for granted. It's all very automatic. And so one of the complex things about brain injuries is the other thing about the brain is that it's also a very personal thing to me. My brain is my brain, and if I have a car wreck and it's the exact same car wreck as another person, their symptoms may be very different because their brain is their brain. And so we just have to keep in mind that the brain is everything about who we are. And so when that brain is injured, it really creates some big holes in our lives because those pieces of who we are not working as well. Some symptoms to keep in mind when it comes to concussions are you can have a headache. Often people with mild concussion, I'm using air quotes on purpose for that. With concussions, they have headaches, but it can go on for extended periods of time. They talk about a pressure in their head. So it's not a headache, but you can almost feel your brain. You can feel this pressure in your head because of the concussion and the fogginess that happens. They can be very confused, and not just a confusion of I don't know who I am, but it more looks like, again, our routines in our life help us be the people we are, and when those routines, we have an internal clock that kind of tells us what's happening. And when the brain, that takes a lot of brain power to process that information, and so when the brain's injured, it just kind of confuses us on what am I doing at this given day, and oh, I'm going here, and it just seems like it's a little confusion. Fatigue is a really important one, and it's not I'm sleepy, it's my brain's tired. I think about the times that I've had to study for a really hard test, or I started a new job. My big one is I take off 2 weeks every year, and when I come back, I am a mess for about 3 days because my brain isn't in a place where it's used to working, or it's used to the information being pushed into it, and that causes me to be very mentally fatigued. And so that mental fatigue becomes a really important symptom of concussion. Changes in sleep patterns are really common. Mood changes, so I could be really overly frustrated very easily, especially in the beginning of the concussion. These things can show up really, but they can also functionally continue on throughout the person's journey. And a lot of times these people say they just don't feel right. Like it's just kind of I don't feel like myself. That's often what we'll hear as well. Some other things are disorientation of kind of time and place, which we talked a little bit about. Also balance. Balance is a very intricate system in our body. And so if the brain is injured and you have some inner ear issues in the same place, that really can affect our balance and the way that we move around. Short-term memory, so I can't remember stuff. That's another symptom that will come out. And then just one of the things I think describes the concussion often is this kind of daze during the process. I remember when my father had a car wreck and he called me after, and of course me working in this world for so long, the first thing he said to me was, I don't have a brain injury, I'm fine. And I said, well, what happened? And he said, well, I think blah, 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 blah. Those words, I think, said to me that he actually had a change in his state of consciousness, and he was very dazed during that process. And so sure enough, he had a concussion, and it didn't get picked up for a while. But if you think something happened and you can't say it, then there's some pretty big chances that you had some change in consciousness during that time period. I think one of the things that we hear a lot from people is just, it's just a bump on the head, so I'll be okay. You'll hear people say, family members say, you know what, he's just not the same. I hear that all the time. One of the things I talk to people about too when they have these kind of injuries is they feel like they're walking through sludge or mud in their mind, like they just can't, the processing speed is really off, and so they feel like they're kind of just walking through cement trying to get a thought out. They can feel themselves thinking. So these are some of the things that you'll hear from someone from concussion. I think the important thing is that when we look at concussions, these things are very common and they happen often. If you feel like you've been not diagnosed, there are some things we'll talk about to go into the next step for resources. But But the important thing is that there is help, and your brain can recover. Sometimes people are left with some of those symptoms. Sometimes those symptoms are lifelong. But this is where we start talking about the new normal. When I work with people initially into their injuries, they really hate me saying that word, the new normal. And these are words that we use in our community a lot. But that's what we have to do, is find the new normal. And what that may look like is I just need a little bit more time to process information. There's always the question too, how long does it take to recover? And the answer is nobody knows. It depends on the person, because each person's different, because each brain is different. And so this recovery process and finding that new normal can last a really long time, and it feels like forever. One of the things that always is kind of shocking to people is when they come in and talk to me and they say, well, this is 6 months old, and I'll say, it's only 6 months old. That's not a very long time in brain injury recovery. And there are things that you can do to help recover. And we'll talk about those. But I think just to make sure that we understand before we move on how complex this brain is and how important it is that every part of the brain is working at the same pace in the same way that it was intended to for you as your own person. Anytime one of those things gets messed up in the brain, other things then go haywire. And so if you are having some kind of symptoms after a concussion, it's incredibly common. We see it all the time. So what do you do with that? I think one of the more important things is that you talk to your doctor. You call the Brain Injury Alliance and get referrals to people that understand brain injury. Not every doctor understands brain injury. In fact, it's a fairly small community. And so that they can hear what you're saying about your symptoms and understand what to do with them. What often we want are these films that we can go to someone and say, hey, look, I have a brain injury, I need proof, because again, that's how we are as a culture. I need proof that this brain injury happened. And unfortunately, a lot of the concussions, things won't show up on the films. So having a doctor that understands that and then can help understand, okay, what happened to you, what are your symptoms, and what do we do next? Because you don't have to live with these symptoms in the way they are. Another thing that you can do is talk to your doctor about getting some kind of cognitive rehabilitation. The cognitive rehabilitation is not a talk therapy, but it's really about helping the brain readjust and what I call rewire. I know there's lots of doctors that probably don't like me saying that because it's not a medical term, but I'm a functional person. And really what's happening is how it's getting those neurons to reconnect in a way that makes sense to your brain in that moment. Sometimes it's compensation. So compensation is a big word for having an outside brain. I have a planner. I cannot use a phone to do that. I have to write everything down because that's the way my brain works. And that's the other process to this, is if your memory's not working well, let's put a compensation in place so that you aren't stressed out all the time trying to remember. One of the things that happens with that then is you're burning all this energy and this capacity trying to remember, and you don't have the capacity and energy for other things, and other symptoms come up. So it's just this big, almost like a hamster wheel that we have to start pulling things out. I would say too is, talk to other people that have lived through the journey that you have right now. It's a very different thing for me to talk to someone about what it's like to live with a brain injury. I have lots of information about that. Could talk about it all day long. I've never lived the journey. So getting in touch with the Brain Injury Alliance, finding out support groups around. These groups are actually really great at helping with strategies and compensation, and just knowing you're not the only one. It can feel like a very lonely place for any trauma when we're feeling like we're alone in it, and having that other person that when you start talking, they say, oh my gosh, you understand what I'm saying, can be a very real experience for them. So support groups would be a really good place to start as well. And I think just talking to family and friends and having the courage, because it can feel very overwhelming, but having the courage to say, hey, have you noticed anything that has changed since I had this concussion? One of the very interesting, but I think most difficult things about brain injury is it can change our perception of ourselves. So there's this filter that I use in my brain to look at my own self-awareness of how I'm acting or what I'm doing. And the brain injury can really change that filter. So even talking to people around you and just saying, hey, this is what I'm feeling, can you tell me what you're seeing, is a really good way for you to get some assurance that, you know what, yeah, that is it, or no, you're doing okay. And I think that perception then can be really important emotionally as well. I do think that one of the things that is really important as well is that you just give yourself time. If you've recently had a concussion, it's really going to probably take some time. Nobody can tell you that. We can be very impatient with that process. We want our life back. It's really difficult to do that when your brain's not working in the way that it's supposed to. So you have to just be patient with the process. And that's another thing you hear us say a lot, is that this process, and it's a journey. It's not a sprint, it's a marathon. And we have to just take the time it takes because the brain heals in the way that it decides to heal. And I think the last thing I really want to encourage you to do is know that it's going to be okay. I've worked with thousands of people with concussions, and in the beginning it feels very overwhelming, and you feel like you're never going to find who you need to be. You will find that new normal. That new normal may be back to where you were, and maybe a very different new normal, and no one can tell you that for sure. But what I think is the most remarkable thing about working in this world is we see how much that new normal is actually really wonderful. And to be a part of that process is really an amazing thing for those of us that work in this world. And I think that's the last thing I would encourage you to do. If you're feeling like you're not quite sure what to do, if you're feeling like you're trying to adjust to what this brain is and you feel like you need help with that, finding a counselor you can talk to who understands brain injury, about how to figure out that new normal becomes really important, because you're dealing with a brain that isn't yours. And what I mean by that, it's a very changed thing if you're having all these symptoms than what you had before. And so you really need sometimes someone to help you walk through, what does this new normal look like? How do I grieve who I was? How do I decide what to do next? And having that person that understands the brain injury can be very helpful for that. So I appreciate your time today, and if you have any other questions about concussions and living with brain injury, then the Brain Injury Alliance of Arizona is a beautiful reference for that and a beautiful resource as well. Thank you.